We turn our souls to you this morning. Give us what we need to take away what we do not need. To be your loyal and committed children, for we ask in your Son's name. Amen. There's a story that comes to us from the 19th century about a wagon train that was going from the east to the west. And it could have been the Donner Party, I'm not sure. But they camped on the floodplain of a river, and during the night there was a flash flood, and it took the wagons away, which was also contained their food and weapons and, the stuff for survival. So the next morning, the leader of the wagon train got a scout and sent him out to see if he could find some food. And after half a day, he reported back, and he said, "I've got good news, and I have some bad news. What do you want first?" And the fellow said, "Well, give me the bad news first." And the scout said, "Well, all we have to eat are buffalo patties." And the man said, "Wow, what's the good news?" And he said, "Well, there's plenty of them." It's a matter of perspective, isn't it? I've been a United Methodist minister for 35 years, and I've been blessed with being the pastor of many types of churches, many styles and characteristics. From my first church was in Cherokee County, was 15 members, 5 in attendance, and the baby in the congregation was 79 years old. And all the way to 2,900 members, to where the church was so big we had church within a church within a church within a church. And I've had churches that were deep in debt, and I've had churches that were free as the breeze financially. But as you look at those churches, as different as they are, there's always commonality between churches. And those of you who are ministers know what I'm talking about. There's things that don't change. They're common to each one of the congregations. Regardless of debt or lack of same, there is never enough to take a risk in most churches. In most churches, we prepare our budgets in the fall of the year, and as we build those budgets, we pick up our bulletin, and it shows how far behind we are in the giving, the tithes and offerings. And then we set our budget according to what we're not getting. And so by the end of the year, we're still not doing what we need to be doing. We're not growing, we're not thriving, we're not challenging ourselves to do more, because we're setting the budget for the following year against the scarcity of this year. And of course, at the end of the year, somehow God reigns in our souls, and we eke out and balance the budget by the end of the year. But we've already established the budget for the next year, which is the same as it was the last year, or even less. So you see where I'm going with that. It's also in business. I've talked to several business people here in Myrtle Beach, and many of them tell me that they're having it better over the last 2 years. 11, 12, and one told me almost 15% increase over the last 2 years. But when we start talking about the economy and what's going on in the economy, we start getting really scarce. We start talking about the downside of everything. And that dark, hovering shadow of doubt hurts. The scarcity mentality is more, I fear, an excuse rather than a reason. It's an excuse to be tight-fisted. It's an excuse to be selfish. I say that because many who came through the Depression years skimped and scraped and saved, and the grandparents and your parents, and maybe some of you who went through that period, how you had to save everything. But that same generation that went through that Depression, raking and scraping, is also the same generation that paid for World War II. It's the same generation that built the infrastructure that we now enjoy in this country. It's the same generation that after World War II rebuilt Europe. The same generation that came back and then retooled the United States in the 50s and 60s. So I'm not sure that we can blame somebody who is prudent, who saves, and then opens their hand in his very giving. So it amazes me how we in the West tend to be driven by a scarcity mentality. On a world scale, we have an overabundance of things, yet you hear us talk, you would think that we're paupers, homeless, and very near starvation. To hear us talk, you would think that our clothes are ragged and tattered, and there are no shoes for our feet, and we walk uphill both ways to work and back. But I remember one time down in Jeremy, Haiti, we were finishing up lunch. We were working on an orphanage building down there, and we were all sitting around, and there were a lot of people grumbling and complaining because all we had to eat were bananas and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and some nuts and a fruit drink. And they were complaining and moaning and groaning. As all that complaining was going on, I happened to look out the window and I saw this little group of children standing on the edge of the road. And on the edge of the counter were a couple of bananas and some nuts and 2 fruit drinks. And I just scooped that up and went out to the corner and began to pass it out to these little children. And I'll never forget the oldest one in the group. When I handed him the nuts, you would have thought it was Christmas time. He was so excited about getting those nuts. But before I could turn and walk away, he put his hand on my arm and took half the nuts to give them back to me. In the midst of that scarcity, in the midst of that depravity, he was willing to share. There we were, from a culture that has everything imaginable in a land of deprivation and starvation. We would soon return to our abundance and hold on still to our scarcity mentality. They, however, would remain there in that scarcity, but yet celebrate anything that was given to them. Anything given was an abundance to them. Now, what I have noticed is this. Those of us who tend to always look up feel deprived. Regardless how good we have it or how wealthy we are, all the blessings we have, because we're constantly looking up, oh, I don't have as much as Bill Gates. I don't have as much as Warren Buffett. So therefore I'm poor. And very rarely do you see people looking this way, looking down at the other 6.7 billion people on this planet that are living on $2 a day. 6.7 billion people living on $2 a day. Very rarely do we look down at them and say, oh my, what a blessed life I have. How fortunate I have got it. What creates this scarcity mentality? Where is its genesis? How is it birthed? Well, my guess, it's in the soul. Some suggest that it begins with, we feel deprived as a child, either by emotionally or we didn't have something that our friends had, and therefore we turn our life into this emergency mode, and there's never enough. There's never enough, and there's never enough money or enough time. And that scarcity mentality goes on to affect our entire lives. It steals away hope and joy. How can you be hope-filled and joyful if you think that the next minute with a wink, you're not going to have enough to survive? And it causes us to be impulsive and compulsive. And marketeers know this very well about us. That's why they put all that stuff at the cash register, So when we're there ready to check out, we see all this other stuff, and we got to grab it, buy it at the last minute. And it's why on commercials, if you noticed these product commercials that come on early in the morning, I'm an early riser, so I get to see some of this. They always have the clock in the background. Next 3 minutes, it's going to be over. Or next day, or one more week, or next month, and you're not going to get it. And people jump up and they buy it. They buy things that they don't even use because the clock's running out. And they're afraid that they may not get something that somebody else has. Now, I agree with the noted clinical psychologist Melanie Greenberg, who said within the scarcity mind is an attitude of ingratitude. In the scarcity mind is the attitude of ingratitude. There is no sense of gratefulness for what one already has, and they're miserable because they only see what they don't have. I've often wondered, how in the world can anybody believe that they're going to get happier getting more when they're not happy with what they already have? Help me understand that. And that has me think long and hard about how us in our culture, how we have so much and the world has so little. I'm grateful for having learned at a young age a little about looks and time. I know I'm a little scarce about looks, but I also learned at a young age that God didn't need me to be another Lee Majors. Back then it was Lee Majors and Farrah Fawcett. They were the poster child of beautiful people. Today, I guess it would be George Clooney and what's her name, Scarlett Johansson. Anybody argue with that? But I learned early on that God didn't need me to be another Lee Majors. Because if he made me to look like Lee Majors, one of us was a total waste. Waste of time and energy. Go home today and look at yourself in the mirror and introduce yourself to yourself and thank God made you who you are. Because God didn't need you to be somebody else. He needed you to be who you are. And while we're at all this, let's also mention the scarcity of time. This goes in here, I think. I talk to a lot of people, and they'll say, I don't have time for that. I don't have time for that. I can't do that. I just don't have the time. Well, guess what, folks? Everybody on this planet has 24 hours a day. Nobody has 25. Not one single human being has 1 hour more. You see, when we say, I don't have time, we're saying, I don't want to rearrange my priorities. I don't want to give up time of what I'm already doing to do that. Everybody has the same amount of time. And that kind of gets us over into that tithing thing too, doesn't it? Yeah, all of us have 100%, don't we? If you only have $1 to your name, you have 100% of that dollar. If you have $1,000, you have 100% of that $1,000. Whatever you have, it's 100%. And guess what? 10% of that's God's. 10% of it is God's. But it's sort of like that time thing. We establish priorities. But I also discovered early, in the end, you're no different than the one whose things are less in quality or less in quantity. In God's eyes, at least, the wealthiest is not greater than the poorest, and the poorest no less than the wealthiest. For you see, at the end of the day, at the end of life, we are not what we own. We are not what we have. Harvey Lee, my maternal grandfather, taught me this. There was a certain fellow in our town who always talked about money, how much he made, how much he had, how much he spent on this or that. He even bragged about his philanthropy. And we all kind of chuckled behind him, not in front of him, but we all kind of chuckled behind him, thinking if he gave away as much as he says he did, he wouldn't have anything. We all knew, that he took a lot of stock. He was what he owned. And he had a fleet of expensive cars. He wore the best suits. And he had homes from New England to Nassau. And one day, he slowly drove down Main Street in his 1946 gold convertible Bentley, waving at everybody on both sides of Main Street as though he were in a one-man parade. And being 9 years old and having just stepped out of McClellan's Five and Dime, where I spent my allowance, I saw that Bentley go by and I froze. And I thought, wow, look at Mr. A. Isn't he somebody? And I watched that car go down Main Street. And my grandfather was watching me. And when we got around back to the parking lot and got in my granddad's 1950 four-door Ford Custom, he said, "You were impressed, weren't you? You were impressed with Mr. A's fine car." "Yes, sir, I was." He said, "How many tires did that car have?" 4. "Did it have a windshield?" "Yes, sir." "Did it have seats?" "Yes, sir." "Did it have windows that went up and down on the side?" "Well, yes, sir." So does ours. So does ours. He may look better going where he's going than we will, but we'll all get to where we're going. He's just going to look better in getting there, he said. Mr. A can't wear but one suit at a time, regardless of how many suits he has hanging in his closet. He can't wear but one pair of shoes at a time, regardless how many shoes are in the floor of that closet. He can't live in one house but at a time, regardless how many houses he owns. He can't drive but one car at a time, regardless of how many cars are in his garage. And he can't add one extra minute to his day. Harvey Lee was very astute. I changed my mind. I wanted to be like Harvey Lee and less like Mr. A. Now, in the world, we are Mr. A. To the world, to the 6.7 billion people on this planet living on $2 a day, we look like Mr. A to them in that gold Bentley convertible riding up and down Main Street. Those who gathered around Jesus that day were about as hungry as that 6.7 billion on this planet. You see, back then, there was about 1% of that population that were affluent, about 97% of them living hand to mouth. And those people who gathered around Jesus that day were already hungry when they got there. And Jesus sat in that boat, and he was teaching from the boat, and the shadows began to lengthen. He got on the shore, and he kept on teaching, and the shadows got longer. And thankfully, the disciples saw what was happening. They're into the crowd. They're being sensitive to the crowd. They're in the moment. And they go to Jesus and say, these people are hungry, Jesus. Let's send them into town and let them buy themselves something to eat. Well, guess what? They didn't have any money to buy something that they could go to town. And Jesus says to them, no, they don't need to go to town. You give them something to eat. You give them something. 5,000 people, these disciples are supposed to give them something to eat. And in this gospel text, unlike Mark and Luke and John, you don't see them going out and taking a little boy's lunch and bringing it back. You almost get the sense that the food is the food of the disciples. It's their food. It was the food that they were counting on for that day to eat. And the disciples say, look, all we have here is this little bit of stuff. And then we have that great scene where Jesus takes the bread and the fish and he lifts it. And you get that image of Jesus in the upper room for the Last Supper. And you get that image of communion, gathering around the table here, breaking the bread and drinking the cup. Jesus blesses it. And he hands it to the disciples. They take what they have and they give it to other people. And as they begin to give and they share, each one begins to share with another until eventually everybody is fed. Everybody is satisfied. And there's more than enough left over. Enough to feed them all again if they wanted seconds. Everyone is fed. You know, the Romans had a saying, you eat because of Caesar. Caesar grants you the right to eat. And here comes this Galilean carpenter along and says, no, everybody's fed when everybody shares. You give them something to eat, he says. Now, to be sure, the source of food is God. But the means of production and distribution are human. When people go hungry, it's not God's doing. When people overeat, when nations hoard food, it's not God's doing. It's like Walter Brueggemann said, the only shortage in the world today is the shortage of will to share what God has provided to us. So, you give them something to eat. Now we get it. Our bread does not have to be fresh baked bread. It doesn't have to be rye bread. It doesn't have to be whole wheat. It doesn't have to be gluten-free. Our fish doesn't have to be king mackerel. It doesn't have to be farm-raised catfish. It could be a can of those little hairy, stinky, salty anchovies. What matters is, whatever we have, will we offer that to God? Will we give God what we have? And if we do give God what we have, if we give what we own, if we share what we have for Jesus' blessing, Jesus won't get nervous with our little picnic lunch. Jesus will take it and break it, bless it, and Jesus will make it enough. I'll let you in on a little secret. The scarcity mentality has nothing to do with money. Nothing at all. It has nothing to do with the amount we own. This is instead a spiritual issue, pure and simple. It's a spiritual issue. Giving is spiritual. So, when the church is unable to make budget, it's not because we have little resources, it's because we have little faith and we have little trust. Giving requires trust. Giving requires faith. I'll tell you who taught me that. It was that little woman in the Gospels who was in the temple and all she had was a couple of pennies. And Jesus saw her open her purse and toss those pennies in, her last cent. So it has nothing to do with how much we have. It has to do with how much we're willing to give. And that takes faith. There's a story about a boy who heard about Albert Schweitzer's missionary efforts in Africa, and he really wanted to help. So he went to his piggy bank, and he broke it open, and there was a few little coins in there. And he went about the house, and he checked the cushions like we used to do. And he pulled out some more coins, and he did a couple of odd jobs and made a few more coins, and he finally got enough to purchase a bottle of aspirin. And then he wrote a letter to the Army Air Corps. He wrote a letter and sent the bottle of aspirin to the Army Air Corps and asked, if you have a plane flying over Africa, please drop this to Dr. Schweitzer. And the general there read that letter. And he started sharing that letter. And eventually it went around to other Army bases, and they started a collection, and they started sharing medical supplies. And when the plane finally went to Africa, they dropped 4.5 tons of supplies to Albert Schweitzer. All because of one little boy willing to share what he had and one bottle of aspirin. That turned into 4.5 tons of medical supplies. And Schweitzer said, I never thought one small child could do so much. It all began because one child did what he could. There are hundreds of people just outside these walls. Hundreds of them. Christ speaks to us this morning about them. He says to us, people of faith, trust me. Have faith. Stop looking at how scarce you think you have it and count the blessings that I have already given to you. Now, go. Shoo. Go. Go out there in the highways and byways. Go. You give them something to eat. Amen.